Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I want to hit up on another point again that I covered in a video I did earlier because a lot of people didn't seem to grasp that point. And that point is that when you reduce range of motion to give a muscle better leverages so that you can lift heavier weight on a partial repetition of some type, it doesn't mean that the muscle itself is actually working harder. And I want to break that down so that people understand that a little bit better. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. Because what happens sometimes when people do this, sometimes they'll feel a cramping or a burning in that muscle when they do this, and they'll mistake it for, aha, I must have worked it harder. What happened is you just worked it a little bit different. And we know that working a muscle a little bit different doesn't actually guarantee muscle growth. It is progressive overload or progressive workload that causes muscle growth. And shocking a muscle, overloading it, all of that stuff, that doesn't significantly increase muscle growth. It's consistently, slowly increasing work over time. Increasing the amount of work a muscle is doing 1% here, 1% there, doing it consistently week after week, month after month, year after year, is how you cause a muscle to grow. There's no need to shock a muscle or overload it. And here's the problem with this idea that doing this will work. First of all, obviously, it takes less work, total work, to move a weight a shorter distance. Meaning if you take any given amount of weight with any given exercise, or even just pushing it on the ground, if you move a weight twice as far, it takes twice as much work. I think most of us understand this concept. It's twice as hard to do it. So automatically, if you were to take an exercise and reduce the range of motion, it automatically becomes easier before any leverages get involved. This isn't even talking about leverages, things like that. You're doing less work when you move a weight a shorter distance. Okay, that is basic physics. Anyone should understand that. When you understand that it is work that recruits muscle fibers, it's not a hard concept to understand that actually if you're reducing range of motion, you will have to do more work. You'll have to do more repetitions to get the same amount of work. Now, what you also need to understand when you're dealing with muscles, there are angles and leverages and things involved. Your bones are actual levers, right? And most people can understand the concept of a lever, everything from a teeter-totter to a car jack. Well, let me ask you a question. When you get under a car jack, do you notice that the angle that you put the jack at, or how far you grab the jack down the handle, affects how fast you can pump the weight up, right? It affects how easily, how much work you have to put in to lift that car. Now, when you lift a car with a car jack, if you were to just come up and deadlift the back of it, a lot of you would say, there's no way I could do that. There's no way I could deadlift that car from behind. But you get a jack, and it gets real easy. But sometimes when you first get under the bumper of a car, and again, most of you will understand this analogy, it's really hard to get the leverages right? Sometimes you've got to do shorter strokes and it's harder to get it started. Then when you can do the longer strokes because of the changes in leverage, it gets easier. It seems like it becomes easier to start lifting the car at certain points depending upon the angle of the handle, how far you can grip it, right? There's leverages involved. Now, your bones are like levers. They're like the arm of a jack in a way, and your muscles are what's producing the force. So when you think of even the bicep, a simple muscle like the bicep here, right? This is a lever, this is a weight here, and the amount of force that it takes to move against that gravity is different at different points because you've got a lever arm here. And you can change it based upon where it is in relation to gravity, right? Further back here is going to be different than doing it up here, right? The weights are going to feel different depending upon how far you are from the pull of gravity, the lever angle, all of this stuff. There's a lot of things involved. And I don't want to overcomplicate this because what ends up happening, people don't understand these basic leverages and they start doing partial exercises and they honestly think that they've worked a muscle harder or that they've overloaded it. But here's the point. At what point has overloading a muscle with some massive amount of work ever been a requirement for muscle growth? It's not. All you have to do is work a little harder than you did the week before. A little harder than you did the week before, and it will start growing and keep growing. Right? This is basic exercise science, basic biology. We all know this. We all know this. You just got to make it do a little more work. Furthermore, if any exercise was actually superior at generating more work, you wouldn't need to do as much of it, right? Because you can only stimulate so much muscle growth in a session, and if something is better at stimulating a given muscle, you should be able to do less of it and get the same muscle growth than an exercise that isn't as good. Again, understandable. I think most people will follow that. If it's better, you shouldn't need to do as much of it to stimulate the muscle as much as it's going to grow in one workout. You can only stimulate so much growth at once. But you know what? If you did more work with an exercise that doesn't stimulate it as much, it would also get as much growth as the bad exercise. Something people need to understand there. Muscles only understand growth stimulus. They only understand how much work they did. As far as the actual muscle growth, now this affects performance, but as far as muscle growth is concerned, your muscles really only care about how much work they had to do, how many muscle fibers they had to recruit, how many fibers got exhausted. That's all it cares about. It cares about how much work it did. It doesn't really care about how you got it there. It's going to grow based upon what it was forced to do. So even an exercise that maybe stimulates 10% less per rep or per set, you'd only need to do about 10% more work to get the same growth. Again, concept I think most of you can grasp. Think that through for a moment. Think that through for a moment. Now, when you look at the analogy I just gave you with the bicep, what happens when we go to exercises like we were arguing about rack lockouts? Which again, people doing above the knee deadlifts with straps and everything else, trying to overload their upper back. Well, the upper back doesn't work as hard at the top. It doesn't work as hard at the top. Just like with a lot of other exercises, there's certain points in a range of motion where a muscle works less hard. But I guess people are thinking, well, because the hamstrings are working less once you get past that point, that the upper back is doing all of it, but the upper back works at the bottom of a deadlift. Think about that. Your thoracic erectors, middle back, upper back, it's all being worked at the bottom of a deadlift. You know what? When you're deadlifting, again, look at the angle that your torso is at. You have more force pulling downward on you at the bottom because you're bent over more, and once you start to lift it, your torso is more upright. All right, think of the leverage there, the gravity versus the lever. Gravity pulling down, here's the weight, here's your torso. When you're down here, that upper back is working hard. It works less as it gets higher because of the angle versus the pull of gravity. If you start above the knee, you're pulled in closer. You're able to start more upright. You're able to put the upper back in an anatomical position to where it doesn't have to work as hard to move the same weight. So people are like, no, you're doing this to make it work harder because it has to lift more weight. But lifting more weight isn't harder for it. That's the whole point. It's easier. You have to add more weight on a rack pull to get the same amount of work done. I'm going to state that again. You have to add more weight because look at the angle arm. Look at the leverages involved. When you're up here, starting with the weight further in, and you're more upright, if you were to put the same amount of weight on there, all the upper back muscles and mid back muscles would work less. You have to increase weight to get the same amount of stimulation. As if you had gone all the way to the bottom. And here's the thing, it's not like that stuff isn't limiting you on your deadlift. Those muscles can be maximally worked on a normal conventional deadlift, just as much as they can on a rack pull. Just that you do it with a lighter weight. You do it with a lower chance of injury. But you have to think about the leverages involved. You're not actually working harder, just like when you're dealing with a jack. When you adjust the leverages and angles of a jack, lifting the car the same amount of distance can be easier or harder. That car weight didn't change, but the effort that you're having to do to lift it is easier because of the leverages involved. There's a lot of that going on with bones and muscle structure. All right, rack lockouts make the lift a lot easier. That's why you're lifting more weight. You're not overloading your upper back. And again, in what world do you ever have to overload a muscle to make it grow? This is going back to the same sort of bullshit that bodybuilders say about shocking a muscle. When has this ever been required for muscle growth? It's not even a factor. You just have to increase workload over time. That's what causes a muscle to grow. Progressive workload, progressive overload over time, making the muscle work a little bit harder, a little bit harder, a little bit harder, and it adapts to that. It grows in response to that. And there's a lot of other exercises. When you look at this, you should be able to see the same thing. If you ever increase the amount of weight that you can do on an exercise that doesn't add extra muscles in, then you've actually made the exercise easier. That means that the muscles have to work less with any given amount of weight. It's not that you can lift more, you have to lift more. All right, when you create an angle on an exercise that's easier to do, you have to add more weight or it won't give you as much growth. It's a requirement. It doesn't mean that it's going to grow more because you've added more weight. It's going to grow less if you don't. And that's true of every exercise out there. The only time that adding weight to an exercise over what you could do on a standard variation causes more muscle growth is when adding new muscles in happens. Meaning, for example, like we pointed out, that most people's overhand grip pull-up, most people for the full range of motion can't do quite as many reps or as much weight as they can with an underhand grip chin-up, right? We understand that. That's for most people. Why? Because the back works just as hard in both, but you've added the biceps in. The biceps come in and do more work, so they let you be a little bit stronger on the exercise because it's actually a longer range of motion. You're moving your body a couple inches further on that version, but because you've added another muscle in more strongly, it lets you lift more weight. But when you're using the same muscles, particularly if some muscles get removed to some extent and you can move more weight, it's because you've made the exercise easier. Making the exercise easier and then adding weight doesn't necessarily stimulate anything that you wouldn't have gotten with the original exercise. Guys, there's no need to reinvent the wheel here. Basic exercises will get you a really, really long way. And I understand there are points to where we need to deviate from that. There are points to where you need specialized training, but the overwhelming majority of people out there aren't going to benefit from doing a bunch of heavy partial exercises. They're actually going to get better development, better strength, better athleticism from performing full range of motion exercises. They're actually going to get more out of it. The difference is when someone has a specialized weakness for a sport-specific reason they need to work on. But for the most people, that's not going to happen for a very, very long time. Alright guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.